This is a Guide Your Light network production, creating podcasts with purpose.
My name is Kiani Mills, and this podcast is created to help you see, feel, and experience the human side of business. I'm a business owner, an entrepreneur, and a parent. And like many who have travelled this path before me, I've been through the lows of the lows and the gut-wrenching pain. But I've been through the triumphs and the wins and the indescribable highs, all of which I consider to be my lessons in the school of life. On this show, we are going to start some conversations to ignite new world ideas into some very old age businesses. So if you're a leader, a business mind, or an entrepreneur, get ready to think, act, and feel differently so that we can all reach a new level of business success together. So, what are you waiting for? Welcome back to this week's episode of She Can Humanise Business. This is the podcast that I've created to intertwine our two worlds between what we like to see as one or the other, but in my beautiful world of purple, we like to bring them both together. So I enjoy bringing guests onto the show who are not only humanising businesses, but also considering the human elements outside of business to then wrap our world together. Because as far as I'm concerned, business is life and life is business. So this week's guest, I am so excited to have Cam Fraser on the show to come and speak to us about his world, which for some of you may be going, how does it work? How does it intertwine? How does a sexologist come on a business podcast? But for my recent listeners and my I would say my fans, you will know that we don't always talk about the boring business stuff. So today is not a boring business stuff episode. And Cam, thank you so much for joining us today.
No, I'm excited. Thank you for having me, and thanks for putting up with my tardiness as well.
Never. Life happens. Children happen.
That's right, they do, yep.
Yes, illness happens. It is absolutely fine, and we're here now. So thank you so much.
No worries.
Now, I start every episode with the famous question of what does humanising business mean to you?
Well, for me personally, in the business that I run, humanising business means acknowledging, and I think you mentioned this before, the human elements of business. And so specifically for my business as a sexologist, as a sex coach, that's acknowledging pleasure and sensuality and eroticism and sexual energy as a encompassing word for kind of all of that. You know, it includes arousal and boundaries and anything to do with our sexual expression. So I really try and acknowledge those human elements of me personally as the face of my business, but also for my audience, people that I'll never necessarily meet one-to-one, but who I know are kind of out there engaging with my work. And then also for my clients and people that I meet at in-person events and things like that. How can I really celebrate, recognize, and acknowledge their humanness with regards to sexuality, eroticism, pleasure, arousal, consent, and boundaries? I think all of that is maybe not necessarily, I don't want to project here, but maybe not necessarily encouraged in a lot of mainstream business spaces to think or even talk about that. It's a bit of an HR nightmare, I would suggest. So so the sexology, sex coaching, sexuality professional space for me is like a real beautiful opportunity to acknowledge those areas and to humanize business in that way.
Oh, I love that so much.
Yeah, thanks.
Oh, that was such a beautiful representation. And really what I wanted to highlight today is because as we are humans first, as humans first, and the idea of wanting to be whole humans, that impacts the way that we show up in business, regardless of what we do for a job. Yeah. So for me, I'd really like to bring things back right to the very start today to say, well, if you want to show up in business and be the best version of you and be a whole human, I'm going to argue that starts at home. That starts internally. That starts with you. And for what you do, I feel like this is a really, really important concept, especially for men.
Yeah, I have done a bit of research, and I know that there's a correlation between sexual satisfaction at home and work performance in the workplace. We know there's a relationship there between how fulfilled and sexually expressed you feel and how much pleasure you're experiencing and how either productive or effective you are at work. So I really want to make that point to begin with, because that's typically how I get men involved in the conversation. How can I be more productive? How can I like make things happen? How can I achieve my goals a little bit better? And I'll leverage that to talk to men about sexuality and the importance of pleasure, because that's a lot of guys' mentality, right? They're like, pleasure for pleasure's sake is not necessarily their go-to frame of reference. They're like, why did I waste my time on pleasure? I don't need it. But if I can frame it as like, well, the more pleasure you have, the better you're going to be at work, then they're like, oh, I'm listening now, right? So that's the first point I want to make. But I definitely agree with you that the way that we interact with the world. I often say this. I often say that like our sexuality is inextricably linked to who we are as a human being, right? And that not only involves how we interact with people that are family members and partners and things like that, but also our colleagues and our bosses and our subordinates and people that we have a working relationship with. So if there's like an area of your life, sexually speaking, that you feel repressed about, or that you lack boundaries around, or that you feel a lot of shame and guilt around, that's going to be in one way or another impacting and influencing those relationships that you have with colleagues. Maybe you have a lot of difficulty saying no to things, right? Maybe you always say yes to stuff. That's very common for a lot of guys, is if sex is put on the table in whatever form or way, they will say yes. A lot of guys have difficulty saying no to sex, because the mentality for a lot of men is like, oh, I'm lucky if I get to have sex. I should always be wanting it. I should always be on and thinking about it. And so there might be a difficulty there to say no in another area of their work life, for example. That's one kind of area that I see. But so really exploring and unpacking, and I think like just discovering more about your sexuality and your sexual self not only helps you in that realm, but it has these beautiful ripple out effects into your work life, for example.
Yeah, absolutely. And something that's popped for me as you were speaking is the real true concept for me anyway, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but if we're not exploring our sexuality in a healthy way, then it can come out in really unhealthy ways.
Yeah, definitely. There's kind of like this analogy that I think of, which is if you try and push something down so hard, it'll like shoot out in a different direction, right?
A blown up balloon.
Yeah, totally.
You try and stand on a blown up balloon, that thing will pop out sideways.
That's exactly right, yeah. And, you can think even more extreme here. And another example that I think of is like, I'll just say Catholic priests, right? The repression of their sexuality
example.
being manifested in really horrible, detrimental ways. So, yeah, I agree with you. And I think that like the more we... like a lot of that is like societally driven as well, right? Like the more we like adhere to these really rigid, narrow definitions about masculinity and sexuality and like what pleasure is supposed to look like. A lot of men are getting those messages from pornography as well, for example, which are very limiting. Then any deviation from that, whether it's a positive or negative deviation, is going to be seen as weird or wrong or shameful, or they're going to have guilt around that. And so I think that like that is there's a lot of fear there. I see a lot of fear in men in particular around not following that really standardized script of what male sexuality is supposed to be. And I see a very similar fear with regards to men who deviate from like towing the line at work, right? I've got to get the house, I've got to get the mortgage, I've got to get this job that's stable, I've got to have a steady income. I have that fear as a business owner and as an entrepreneur. Like I sometimes crave a steady paycheck where it's just simple, linear,
Don't we
straightforward.
all?
Yeah, right. And so there's
That's been my midlife crisis this last month. Going,
I'm having that existential crisis as well. Yeah.
Totally. What are we all here for? Why am I doing this?
Yeah.
We're humans, right?
Yeah. And there's this standardized linear way of thinking, which is very much how we think about male sexuality. And I think that is transplanted, or maybe vice versa, into the way we think about, work and business. So I've got to like progress in my career, and then I've got to get to the next stage and the next stage, and I've got to tick the next box and the next box. And that's very similar to the way we think about male sexuality. And I think like probably because both of those areas are dominated by men, right? The workforce has historically been male oriented. Study in sexuality has historically been male oriented as well. So we've got this very linear, narrow, straightforward way of thinking about it when we know that humans aren't like that.
No. And through the evolution that we're watching happen as a society, it's not like that anymore. Yeah. And I feel as though it's a beautiful time for men in a safe environment who are encouraged to explore their sexuality and start to enjoy pleasure, because it's not a chore. It's not something that you have to do. It's not something that you have to say yes to. There is a notion that a man is always on, that a man is always ready to go, but that may not be true. So for a topic that I would say could be potentially seen as taboo in this day and age, I feel as though, and I'm so passionate about how important it is for men to feel safe in this world. And on the topic of sexuality and healthy sexuality, where would someone start?
That's a big question, but my go-to answer is always starting with the self. Yeah. So like before you go out and work with a coach or a therapist, or before you go out and try and do something with other people, come back to some introspection and reflection and get a bit of a feel for where you're at. So like some questions that I pose to people in general, whoever's listening really, is like, start to think about, what's my relationship like with pleasure? You know, what were the messages I received about pleasure growing up? What do I do to prioritize pleasure in my life? How do I feel when I prioritize my pleasure? That's very pleasure oriented, but then we can apply those same principles and questions to sex. Like, what do I think about sex? What does sex look like for me? Yeah. Where were the major messages that I received sex from? Who do I admire, in a sexual sense? Who's my sexual role model? These questions can help us unpack the way that we have conceptualized sex and pleasure. And you can do the same thing with relationships, with women as well. So I pose the questions to men like, where did your messages about what women think about sex come from? Because again, there's a whole other set of stereotypes around female sexuality, which I probably won't go into here because it's not my area of speciality. But yeah, really like doing a bit of a stock take and inventory of your own sexual history and belief system. I'm just unpacking your worldview. I think that's the area to start. Well,
this is an area that I'm going to generalize here and say no one would think to ask themselves these questions. No one would sit down with their journal and their pen and be like, oh, I'm going to sit here and think about my sexual explorations and what I think about pleasure and sex. But you're right. The only way to go forwards is to go back.
Yeah.
Where are these beliefs? Where did I learn them? Do I trust the person I believed it from or heard it from or inherited it from? Yeah. So it's a really great notion and concept. And yes, I understand it's a big question, but I feel like it's a really, really perfect place to start because, again, you don't need anyone else for that. And the steps towards taking a healthy, proactive approach to it, really, you're right, starts within.
Yeah, and it's a little bit like cognitive behavioral therapy. It's like, let's determine what your current belief systems are. And then the next step to that is, what have I experienced that challenges those belief systems? So like, for example, I'm working with a client at the moment who his belief system around sexuality has always been like really quite conservative and in a way, like the way that I would describe it is like benevolently sexist. So he's like quite chivalrous and, puts women up on pedestals and is like just inherently quite restrictive. He shared with me that, he always thought that it was women who reluctantly gave up sex to men if they just pursued them for long enough. And that's a story you can see played out in media quite a lot. But he had this experience recently with a woman who approached him to initiate sex and to, like, she expressed her desire. She's obviously done a bit of work around feeling sexually confident and pursued him. And that really challenged his worldview. And so it was like, you've got this way of thinking about the world, but is your lived experience matching up with that? And very often there are challenges and sometimes you have to pry and be like, oh, that actually doesn't line up. It's like, okay, well, if there is a challenge to that worldview, then that must not be true 100% of the time. So what's a new story that I can tell myself? What's a new belief system that I can create? And that's like a very simple way of doing CBT work with people. But it's also narrative therapy. I'm very biased. I'm a big fan of narrative therapy, which is just like thinking about all the stories that you tell yourself about what it means to be a man, what it means to be sexual, what it means to be good at business, what it means to be like a man in business, for example, and going, do these narratives serve me? Do they make me feel really fucking anxious? Do they make me feel really joyful at work? Do they make me actually want to show up more? Or are they, completely detrimental? And then taking the narratives that do work for you and reaffirming those, and the ones that like do make you feel shit and not joyful and make you not enjoy the work, to get rid of those or rewrite them. So it's a really, like, it seems really simple to do, but because they're so ingrained, these biases and belief systems, it takes a little unpacking over the course of well, I'm still unpacking some of mine, and I've been doing this for 10 years. So it takes a while.
It's a lifelong journey, isn't it?
Yeah.
But I think the beautiful thing about that is, number one, being curious enough to ask the questions in the first place. And then number two, being honest enough to answer them with truth. Because we can all, and I know my brain is very, very clever. It's my mind is so smart. It tricks me into magical things of ways of thinking and beliefs that I truly, truly believe. Like I do deep down, but I don't. It's just that the way that was the way I was raised, or that's the people who I was, spending my time with. And it takes a level of acceptance to then go, oh shit, maybe I am wrong. So is that then where you get to a point of having asked yourself the inner questions and getting to a point of being like, all right, I've done a little bit of exploration here. This is definitely something I want to explore on. Let's go find me a coach.
Yeah. I mean, I like personally, I have a lot of free resources online. So before I tell people to start spending any money on anything, I'll be like, there's so much free stuff that you can find.
What a good human.
Yeah. And there's like a lot of really, what I'll say here.
Average, there's a lot of miseducation online as well. And so I do my best to point people towards reputable resources and stuff that's like good quality information and that's going to be beneficial, at least in my opinion, to the people that are seeking it out. So, I wouldn't just say jump on Google and follow the first thing that you find, because God knows what that could be. Yeah, my 14-year-old did a Google search once, and that did not end well.
Yes.
But that started a very important conversation about what we see on the internet that is not actually real.
Yeah, critical thinking skills, yeah.
Absolutely. So anyway, that's a story for another day.
Yes, I can imagine, yeah. I'll be taking some tips of I've got a 2-year-old, so I had a few years before that might happen. But yeah, so that's my first suggestion to people is like, go follow some sex educators online. Go follow some people who you admire or feel inspired by, who are doing things, sexually speaking, or that are being pleasure positive.
Or at least just having these conversations.
Yeah.
And I know I was recommended by a friend to start following you, and then it just happened to be that a week later you were talking in the sunny coast. So I went and watched you in person, which was incredible. And the part that I loved most of all is because you are a sex coach for men, but I learned so much as a woman. And the content that you put on social media as well, on Instagram, is so informative.
Yeah.
There are so many things that as a woman, again, as you said, women have their own ideas and beliefs and makeups around sexuality, and that's someone else's forte. However, for a woman to learn about a man, for me, that felt empowering.
Yeah.
That felt so incredibly... There was a part of me that actually felt irresponsible before for not having sought out this information and thought, oh, I'm ready for a relationship. I know all the stuff. It's like, well, actually, no, I don't. But you're right. It's about finding the voice that is in a healthy or constructive or supportive mannerism, and I'm grateful I found that in you. So thank you for that.
No, thank you.
But I wanted to point out the part for the listeners is that it doesn't matter if you're male or female. Go in and have a look at Cam stuff and have a read about it. And that night that we had the event in the Sunshine Coast, you spoke about some myths, and I found those really, really interesting. Is there a couple off the top of your head that you wouldn't mind sharing with the listeners?
Heaps off the top of my head that I wouldn't mind sharing. So the first one I mentioned a little bit earlier in this conversation is that there's this expectation that men are thinking about sex all the time, that want sex all the time. There's the old wives' tale that men think about sex every 7 seconds or something crazy like that. So that leads into this idea that like men's libido is high, unwavering, unyielding, and that and the converse of that same myth is that like that women don't want to have sex, right? And that leads into my client, who I mentioned before, his belief system, which is that women are the gatekeepers who reluctantly let men have sex with them if they just pursue them long enough, right? That's where that myth leads into. And we know that that's not true from various different angles. One is from the data that we receive from sex therapists in the US in particular, where 50% of heterosexual couples who go and see a sex therapist in the US report libido discrepancies. So there's a difference in who wants sex more than the other partner. And so that's half of all couples that are going. And then half of those couples, so 50% of that 50%, the woman has a higher sex drive than the male partner. So that's a good source of data to tell us, that's more common, that there's, a balance between who is desiring more sex than the other. But also there's surveys around men who talk about their fluctuations in desire over the course of their lifetime, over the course of a week. There's some really beautiful qualitative studies where men journal for a week, and they talk about like how on these days where they feel like they've had a good work day, for example, they feel really productive, they feel more sexual desire for their partner, right? And again, we're seeing a correlation between business and sexuality. And then on other days where they felt like maybe they weren't as productive, or they felt like they were a failure at work because they were maybe reprimanded at work or did something wrong, they have less desire, they feel less confident. And so we know that sexuality and sexual desire and libido not only fluctuates, but is really impacted by our emotions, by our by our attitudes, by like what's happened in our relationship that week, right? And then on a hormonal level as well, people tend to think that testosterone is solely responsible for libido as well. And so like, yes, there is some connection there, but the testosterone myth, I suppose, is like that it's a one-to-one causation. So that if you've got high testosterone, you have high libido.
Yeah.
We know that that's not true as well, because we've seen people men in particular, who have gone on to testosterone replacement therapy, and they've just seen their testosterone levels skyrocket, seen no changes in libido. That data by itself busts that myth. We've seen other information come out where men who are have low estradiol levels, for example, because estradiol is necessary for a healthy hormonal balance in men, just as it is in women, who take estrogen and nothing changes to their testosterone levels, but their estrogen goes up and their libido goes up at the same time. So we're seeing and the point is that like sex drive and desire is impacted by a whole host of like neurotransmitters and chemicals and hormones, and the endocrine system is not a simple one-to-one causation and effect scenario. So and testosterone fluctuates as well. This is something I'm a big educator on. Is like testosterone fluctuates throughout the course of a day. It's high in the morning, it's low in the evening. It fluctuates throughout the course of 30 days and 20-day cycles. So it has a circadian rhythm. It also fluctuates seasonally as well. So it's high in the winter, low in the summer. And it also declines with age. So all of that is contributing to
there's a lot.
The human nature of sexuality, which is that it fluctuates and it expands and it contracts, and it has this beautiful dance and interplay that goes way under-acknowledged when it comes to talking about male sexuality.
100%. And I for me, even that the first part in that myth around a man's libido being impacted by experiences during the day, emotional states, what's going on in the relationship. I know there's probably a lot of women out there that are going, men are just as emotional as women. Because I know for us, likewise, we have a crappy morning with the kids. No, we don't want to tap on the shoulder. Men are the same.
Yeah.
We have a crappy day at work. No, we don't want to we just got a phone call from our parents. There is so many similarities between us in our genetic makeup as humans that has just been squashed so deeply. Men don't feel, men don't experience, men don't, have the same, level of emotional awareness that women do, and all those kinds of things. But it's not true.
I mean, there's some interesting research which suggests that there's physiological differences in the way that we physically feel emotions. So I think, if I recall, there was like, and they do these like heat mappings of the body. So like people subjectively talk about, I felt a lot of warmth in my chest, or I felt like really cold in my hands and whatever. And so there was like and I'll probably butcher this, but someone can correct me.
Give it a crack.
Is that particularly when it comes to frustration, anger, and those like very typically male emotions, right? The emotions that men are oftentimes allowed to experience, right? Men feel that more in their body than they do other emotions. And so that's like the survey, I think, was saying like they feel more warmth in their torso, they feel more like tension in their shoulders, there's like more feeling in their stomach. So they're physically feeling these things, but then a lot of guys won't then express that, right? They won't talk about it. They won't do something to move that, right? To help them feel less of it. They'll stifle it, right? So there's this double-edged sword, I suppose, for a lot of guys, like of them not acknowledging those sensations in their body in the first place, even though they might be feeling it, and then also not talking about that and trying to move through those sensations.
Well, then we have a balloon situation.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. You're back to that squeezing something down and waiting for it to pop out during road rage or during some other, maybe his son has just spewed everywhere in the morning. This is a me
This
scenario.
feels like a real life
This is a very relevant real life scenario.
This is me. Right. So if I'm getting this correctly, I'm going to generalize again. Men feel those more masculine emotions, those deeper anger, rage, frustration, physically feel them internally at a higher level. Then they may feel love or butterflies. And I know as women, we've got our nurturing, we get that little like warm and fuzzy feeling. So for them, that might be a subtler feeling. So it's not that they don't feel it. It's just that it may not be as physically present in their body as what those...
And like we can have a conversation about why that might be. My personal thinking is because that's been quelled in a lot of guys. They've not really been encouraged to tap into those more feminine, softer emotions. They've been more allowed to, societally express their anger and frustration, particularly through sport. That's a whole other conversation. Also through business, I will say as well. I think
agree.
there's a lot of avenues for frustration and anger and manipulation.
I have been yelled at once or twice.
Right. Yeah. So that's from what I understand of the research, psychosomatically speaking, guys are experiencing things, but they're just not very good at talking about it. And so one of the tools that I give men is just really vocabulary for discussing like their sensations in their body. And that not only goes for like anger and frustration, but more specifically for like when they feel affection for their partner, or when they feel pleasure in their body, or when they feel attraction to their, like, how can they talk about that? And usually I just say like, go internally, notice what you feel. Just describe that feeling. I feel a lot of like openness and warmth when when we touch you or when we do this particular thing. Like that's a really simple way of just starting to express those emotions in a very tangible way.
Yeah, I feel like language is a really important part of this as well, because for a very long time, and I'm going to say I'm generalizing so much in this conversation, but men and having the intellectual level of language to be able to express themselves again in a healthy way, maybe another area that for a man, let's pay attention to that. Because for a woman to hear, I'm feeling really open and I'm feeling really receptive to, or I'm really wanting to touch you or feel you, as opposed to, hey, you want to go fuck? There's a very big difference to how a woman will open to a man depending on how the language is passed across the table.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, and I kind of apply this as a principle in my own business, right? I often think about, how do I communicate to my clients? How do I, my existing clients, but also my potential clients? How do I communicate to, people on the internet? I'm much more abrasive to people online than I am to people in real life, for example, especially on social media platforms like TikTok. I just don't give a fuck. And so I'll be much more closed off. But when it comes to, if I'm meeting someone on an alignment call, how can I help them feel good in that moment, right? What can I do to help them feel pleasure in their body, right? And pleasure in a full spectrum sense, not just explicitly sexual pleasure. I feel like that's important to distinguish, because people do hear the word pleasure and only think sexually. But pleasure is like the taste of a coffee in the morning, right? And that beautiful sensation of
got it right now.
aroma and the warmth of it. Yeah. So I often say, and this sometimes it can be taken interestingly. So I'd be curious to see how you take it. But I like to seduce my clients, and seduction for me is not coercion or manipulation, which I think, maybe the word's been a bit co-opted, and it sometimes can really mean that by some certain groups of people. But like to seduce someone for me is to like make them feel good when they're around you. And that's what I ultimately want to do for my clients. I don't want to make them feel shit. I don't want to make them feel shameful. I don't want to make them feel judged. I don't like putting pressure or expectations on my client. We set goals together and work towards them. But the last thing that I want to be doing is making them feel like they're pressured into doing certain things, especially around their sexuality, because that's the exact opposite that we want to have with regards to our sexual exploration is the pressure and the expectation and the anxiety. We want to have the openness and the enjoyment and the pleasure of it, and feeling called to do it, feeling pulled to do it, not feeling like we're being pushed. So for me, that's what I do to like quote unquote seduce my clients. Is like, how can I make them feel good and celebrated in their sexuality and their sexual journey? And I think like that's my, if I circle back to what we shared right at the beginning, that's one of the ways that I try and like humanize my my business practice, right? It's like,
because it's a delicate conversation.
Yeah, totally.
It's so delicate.
Yep.
And it was really interesting for me to hear through that, because you premised it perfectly at the start by saying pleasure and explaining the breadth of pleasure. And instantly for me it goes, okay, we have pleasure senses. It's not generally when we talk about our pleasure centers, it's smelling, seeing, tasting, hearing, touching.
Yeah.
That has nothing to do with our genitals.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
But yet the word has been somewhat bastardized to mean something dirty.
Yeah.
Potentially.
It's very narrow.
Correct. And so same with the word seduction. And gratefully for me, I got my hands on a beautiful book called Dear Lover by David Dider, if I can pronounce his name right.
Yep.
And it is a beautifully sensual book that describes exactly that. You used a coffee, he uses chocolate. Tasting chocolate in your mouth and having that experience and that sensation in all of your senses, in your pleasure senses, that doesn't necessarily relate to having sexual intercourse, but it makes you feel good.
Yeah.
So when you say the word seduction, for me that, yes, it is, again, it has been a very narrowed word, and it's been part of that taboo word of, you want to seduce somebody, that's potentially going to be a negative thing or a dominating thing or whatever it might be. But in that world of pleasure centers and seducing, to me, it's a sense of slow. And even when we go back to the language, it's gentle, it's opening, it's almost like standing with palms open and saying, I'm here to hold space or receive or listen or safety.
Yeah, it's an invitation.
Correct. That's the beautiful word. It's an invitation. And with such a delicate topic, that is how it needs to be addressed.
Yeah, I appreciate you speaking into that. That's why I was curious to see what your reaction would be, especially using it in a business setting, because I know that just from what I've read, the whole idea of seducing clients can come across as quite manipulative and coercive, and I've seen that as well. So I'm mindful of like using the word, so I don't really share it too much. But like, in terms of creating that container for people to like feel vulnerable enough to open up about their sexuality and talk about their sexual history and and even like talk about their fantasies and desires and what they want from their sexuality. Like that's it's a very hard thing to do. It's like super challenging especially for a lot of men, at least the men that I work with, to like really own, hey, I want to do this thing sexually. Because again, if it deviates from that really standardized, pornographized script of like what sex is supposed to look like for them, then they have a lot of fear around it. They have a lot of anxiety around, like, does that make me weird? Yeah. I get asked on the regular, am I normal? Yeah, am I weird? Does this make me, is something wrong with me because I want this? And I think that's like a general thing, but particularly for guys, there's like a lot of hang-ups around like, this is what I should be like as a man and this is what I should be like as a sexual man. And so creating a space for them to let go of that and, invite them in, seduce them into feeling good about just being a sexual person it's a big part of my job. And, I think there's a fear that men have of claiming their eroticism and their sexuality in like that, in the depth and the breadth of it. For societal reasons as well. Like a lot of guys don't want to come across as the guy who's interested in sex too much. I have kind of lent into that, and like that's my whole thing. So I'm comfortable with it, and I'll wear those projections. But like I know a lot of guys have a fear of being labelled creepy or being labelled a weirdo because they talk about sex, or because they want to have a conversation about sex with their partners, or with not necessarily with their partners, but someone who they're dating, right? Like, how do I bring that up in a conversation without coming across as a weird dude? That's a very real fear for a lot of guys. And so, helping them just embody that and let go of those stories is liberating, to be totally honest with you. Like they kind of let go of the fear, let go of the anxiety, and go, hey, I'm not bringing this to the table with an agenda. I don't want to manipulate or coerce you into a sexual experience by having this conversation about sex. I am interested and passionate about it, and I'm curious, right? I think you mentioned the word curiosity before. Like leaning into the curiosity has to start with those questions they ask themselves, but then they can extend that, curiosity out to the people that they're dating, to their partner. Like ask those same questions to those other people in your life, and get to know them a bit more, and help them unpack their own sexual experiences as well.
And at the end of the day, as you said, this again can be seen as an invitation.
Totally.
An invitation. It's not, I'm not putting my beliefs onto you. I'm inviting the conversation to be open. And I just get this massive sense of feeling of a man who has started off in a situation where they're feeling, am I normal? They're feeling incomplete. They're wondering if there's something wrong or there's something missing, and they go through this journey of asking the questions and looking internally and starting to do the work, and then getting to a space of feeling really confident about their sexuality. And I can only imagine how that confidence in that area, instead of it being this dirty little secret that's being hidden in the background and pushed down, it's been embraced and accepted. That person, as they step out of their front door to go to work or to show up to lead a team, to even have a conversation with a staff member or a colleague or an acquaintance, there is a huge part of them that is fulfilled or even acknowledged. Doesn't even have to be fulfilled. It's a journey. It's a lifelong journey. It's not going to be done overnight. But taking that step to really acknowledge and take control of that piece of them, the way that they must show up in life after that, that's the part that I'm like, that is big. And for businesses, we speak about the way that businesses have been done. And we had a guest on, Jeff Allen, who's a coach, a business coach. And we spoke a little bit about the difference between, old age businesses and the corporate structure and the way that the world was. And while we're still getting out of that, it's not so much that, but there is still so many men in charge and men in positions of power who are probably not fulfilled and are refusing to have these conversations. And as a result of that, I'm sure there's something suffering in their lives. So for me, it's this exciting part of something that really doesn't get spoken about in this massive, massive world that we live in. Claiming your sexuality in a safe and healthy way can 100% aid in performance, individual performance outside of the bedroom as well.
Yeah, I think of the reverse of what I shared at the beginning of this conversation, where I was talking about if you have trouble saying no, then you might have trouble saying no at work as well. But the inverse is true as well. If you really go after your desires and you feel comfortable talking about them and you can ask for what you want, sexually speaking, like there's no real that cauldron, that sexual cauldron is like a high stakes situation for you to like speak into your fantasies and desires and ask for what you want. There's no real comparable, at least in my opinion, space where the stakes are that high.
Hell no.
If you can do it in that space, imagine being able to ask what you want at work, right? 100%. I mean, imagine being able to ask for that particular job or ask for that particular position or that raise or whatever it might be. Like being able to ask what you want in the workplace is nowhere near as difficult as asking for it in that like really intimate, high stakes sexual situation, at least in my opinion.
No, I absolutely agree. And instantly I went, well, that job is replaceable. Winning that deal is replaceable. There's always another business. There's always another staff member. But there's only one of you that has sexual needs.
Yeah.
You know, there's like you're right, the stakes feel really high in that sense, and it is a vulnerable place to be. And some of us struggle enough just to talk about our emotions, let alone go to the depths of our sexual desires. I feel like this is a really untapped area of almost like reclaiming the masculine within the masculine for that masculine to then be able to show up in a healthy way for women.
Yeah,
and themselves.
I have so much that I want to share around this. But like something that comes to mind is, and sex educators have been saying this for years. So I'm not the first person to say this, but like if all the CEOs and all the corporate, giants, or if they were all having good sex, then we wouldn't see the corruption and the way that the planet is being pillaged. If we had people just enjoying themselves and experiencing a lot of pleasure, right? There's like a real belief in like the sexuality professional community that if people were just enjoying themselves and experiencing
100%.
pleasure and orgasming, then we wouldn't be having so many shitty situations around
Could
the
you
world.
imagine how happy everyone would be?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And that reminds me of like the Make Love Not War, which I think was John Lennon, but I digress. So I work with a couple of guys who are business owners and kind of higher up in that pyramidal old paradigm structure of business, and there is repression there, right? And they do feel shame around exploring their sexuality, and it's very interesting to see how the control and the strictness and the regimen that they have to have with business is something that they desire to subvert sexually. So, and there's some interesting research out there which suggests that a lot of the men that are interested in submission and, being taken control of by a woman are guys that are higher up in businesses.
Because that's what they do every day.
Yes, and the power reversal is really erotic to them. And so there's some cool conversations there to have about like how our life experiences impact like our sexual and erotic blueprint, let's say. But like, there's a lot of shame in exploring that. So if those men felt more comfortable owning those desires to surrender, really is what you're doing in those situations when you're being submissive. But that's framed as a weakness, and especially in the business sense, you don't want to surrender or submit to anyone, right? Like it's not masculine. So all these stories get wrapped up in masculinity and sexuality and eroticism, and so they play into the perpetuation, I suppose, of that old paradigm of business, or the kind of post-capitalist nightmare that we're kind of living in. But yeah, it's a really fascinating area to look into, which, again, I've only cited a little bit of research. There's not heaps out there, to be totally candid with you. I tried to prep a little bit for this conversation so I could cite some of that. But it's a really, if there's budding researchers listening to this, I'd be like,
please share.
Yeah, look into it, because it's a fascinating area of the human experience, right? It's like how our work life interacts with our sex life.
Absolutely.
I mean, I'm going to go on a huge
Do
tangent,
it.
so please
I love it.
tell
I'm
me
so
to land
excited.
the plane if I need to.
I got like sweaty palms.
Well,
Go.
something that I often see as well is like the mentality that we have around work, which is, like I've got to hustle, I've got to grind, I've got to, if you want to label it, it's like that very masculine, way of thinking about work of like, I've got to always be on, I've got to be achieving, I can't waste any time.
Ego,
time
success,
is money.
totally, time.
I see that being transposed onto our sexual experiences, right? So
100%.
a lot of, and again, especially for men, a lot of guys are like very goal oriented when it comes to sex, rushing for penetration. It's like, get the job done. It's, I've got to make, like, if I don't give her an orgasm, or if I don't orgasm, then sex was a failure. It wasn't successful. It was a waste of time. So this, Protestant work ethic, right? This capitalistic work ethic that we have in business very often makes its way into the bedroom. We don't just leave that at the door, right? It comes into our sexual experiences. Same thing with masturbation. A lot of guys are like really effective and efficient with it. They want to get it done as quickly as possible.
And it's a release. So it's like a depletion instead of, I'm going to feel sensual right now and feel full from doing this. There's such a different energy around the way that it's tackled.
And it's often like for a lot of guys, sex is framed as a reward as well. And
there
something
you go.
that they get if they've been productive enough. Same thing with like not so much with masturbation. For a lot of guys, masturbation is very typically like you mentioned, like a release valve to alleviate some pressure, some tension that they might be feeling. So there's these mentalities that kind of snake their way into our belief systems around sex, and vice versa. You know, it is this two-way correlation. So that's something I wanted to mention as well, because I think there's like some unpacking to do around hustle culture and the grind set, you know, and the Sigma male fucking mindset that a lot of guys have.
100%. And I grew up in the legal industry, property industry, so very male dominated. And you see the men who are at work and in control and throwing out orders and hustling. Yeah, they enjoy their Friday lunches and they have a great time at Friday lunch. But generally the Friday lunch turns into the strip club.
Yeah.
And what do they do in a strip club? They sit back, they have a drink in a hand and they throw out money. Yeah. So again, it's that submissive nature of, fuck, I've been pushing all day and I've been in this kind of like state of like overbearing and dominating control. I just want to release. I just want to relax. I just want to sit back and not do anything and just, you know, ogle this woman that's giving me exactly what I need. Yep. But then how do we balance the polars? Because to me there's this massive polar, and I talk about this a lot, where, you know, the corporate and spirituality world, there's this massive, you know, radical ways of both. And this is where I guess what you were speaking into about the submissive side, where you see the male who has been in a highly dominating work environment want to be submissive. However, for a lot of men, as you said, that's a very raw, vulnerable, shameful in some ways topic. So how going home to their wife and them saying, hey, I just want you to tie me up and, you know, do naughty things to me, might feel really uncomfortable because that's not who you are. That's not who you are in the outside world. So we've spoken about going inwards. We've spoken about getting help from a coach. In those situations of those, I'm going to say those deep, dark feelings of having to repress or suppress those urges and I guess needs, what advice would you have for those men that are feeling like, oh yeah, this sounds a little bit familiar?
Yeah, I guess like my practical advice here is to start to explore your own body. Like I really believe that somatically we hold a lot of the keys to understanding and taking the next step on that sexual journey. So by exploring your body, what I mean by this is like, if there's something that you know that you fantasize about, maybe you've watched it in porn, you know, maybe you have just thought about it, maybe you've done it with a previous partner and not felt comfortable doing that with a new partner, find a way to explore that solo, because you know, when it's partner oriented, a whole bunch of other stuff can come up and it might be a bit overwhelming. So like finding a way to, you know, like using tied up for an example. So if that's something you're interested in and you want to explore, like find a way to do that solo to begin with. It could be with, like if it's you that wants to be restrained, it could be like with putting on some restraints on yourself to begin with. Obviously, I'm not saying handcuff yourself somewhere and throw away the key, but like, you know, experiment with like using if you're a businessman, using a tie, right? Perfect. Tie something around your wrist. Yeah. Notice like how it feels to have the pressure against your wrist. If it's something you have a lot of vulnerability around, like, you know, you can tie one around your chest and like notice what it feels like to be a bit constricted around the chest. So give yourself an opportunity to experiment with like noticing things. So try, like, curiosity, again, I'm a big fan of the word curiosity because I think it should be the cornerstone of our sexuality. It's like exploring and being curious and being experimental with your solo time. Because that'll give you the information that you need to then share with a partner. And, you know, I said before that, you know, pornography has a lot of bad messages, got a lot of answer for it, and I still do believe that. But I also think like ethical porn and porn that's produced by independent producers who, you know, aren't contributing to the systemic issues of the industry, like can be a really healthy avenue for exploring those fantasies that you have as well. And like if there is a particular sex act that you want to do, but you've never been able to talk about it with someone, you know, use porn to help explore that in your body. Like what is it about the act that makes you really turned on? Is it the power dynamics? Is it the attention that you're receiving?
Yeah.
Is it the specific sensations that might be happening? And again, use that as information building, as information gathering. So I really like to think of this as an experiment.
Yeah.
Right? Like it takes the ego out of it a little bit as well, because there's no right or wrong way to experiment with your body. It's just like, what are you learning? Just learning more about your sensations and where your boundaries are. You might do something and notice, oh, that felt like really strongly resistant in my body. Okay, cool. There's a charge there. Let's unpack that a little bit more. So,
and learning those resistances on your own would aid for help and health when you are ready to explore it with somebody else. And
you've got something to tell them.
Absolutely. Yeah. And taking it all the way back to the start of starting by asking yourself those internal questions of, what are my thoughts on pleasure? What are my thoughts on sex? Where does my beliefs come from? Understanding all of that, it's like building a little roadmap so that when you do get to the pointy end of the scale and going, okay, this is my fantasy, this is what I really want to experience, having all of that previous kind of roadmap there, you can be like, where has this come from? Where? Or is there something that I'm not getting, or is there a need in me that's not being filled somewhere else that I'm needing it to play out here?
Yep.
And that can then build into, again, we look at this with our life. This is what we do as any kind of personal development work is, what is my belief? Is that belief serving me? If not, great. Where did that belief come from? Why? There's always a why in it. And then how do we shift that belief or move it or recreate a new belief, and so that we can then go and live our best lives? This is exactly the same concept. It's just something that isn't spoken about.
Yeah. And what I'll say as well is that, like, if you're a guy and you start doing this, two things will happen in your relationships with women. The first is, and this is something I've seen a lot with my clients, is you like, especially if you're dating still, for example, is a lot of women aren't used to men that are really exploring their sexuality. So they'll kind of look at you like deer in the headlights and go, who the fuck is this? Why?
We'll be pleasantly surprised.
Yeah, but
there may be shock.
The reason why there's a shock is because a lot of women have the same stories about men that men do, right?
Yeah.
And similar situation in reverse as well. Because we get the same sex education.
100%.
We get the same
we learn
messages.
it from the same places.
Yeah, so there's a piece here which is, if you're a guy going to be doing this work, at some point, if you're with a partner who maybe hasn't done the sexual journey herself or really looked into male sexuality, there's an education piece that you'll need to do. And so that's something I prep my clients for, is like, you'll probably need to talk to your partner about the separation of orgasm and ejaculation. You'll probably need to talk to your partner about like how you can feel pleasure in all of your body, not in just your penis. You probably need to talk to your partner about your prostate. And I'm just talking anatomically here, right? Then there's the stories around masturbation and ejaculation and things like that as well. So there's so that's the first thing, is like you'll come up against like a, well, what? Who is this? Yeah, type of guy. And like you'll probably need to do a little bit of educating, which is fine. And the other thing that I often notice with my clients as well is like, this is especially true if they're in a relationship, is like there's a much more deeply and enriching experience with their partner. And like so for guys that are dating, if like that's the container they're holding for these women who they're dating, it can be overwhelming, right? Because there's like a lot of emotion involved, and there's a lot of connection, and there's a lot of intimacy, and that can be like, quite intense for people who haven't had that before.
Of course.
So,
because sex goes from physical, which is the way that we've known it, to being emotional, spiritual, connected at those depths of love.
Comprehensive.
Yeah,
as opposed to just being one-dimensional.
Yeah.
So, that's what I often share with men as well. It's like, if you're going on this journey, do it for you, and just be mindful that like when you are connecting with other people, not everyone has the same understanding of male sexuality as you might now have about yourself. So,
But I guess on the flip side of that is that once you do start to open Pandora's box, as such, as we know, the universal law of attraction is that we will in time start to attract that level of person who is willing to have those conversations or ready to have those conversations. Maybe they don't know it yet, but maybe they do. And so by opening up something that you've been potentially frightened to or shameful about or embarrassed or guilty about, you're opening also up your ability to connect with other people who are on a similar journey. So this is for relating, this is for acquaintances, and also this is for business. Because I know for me that when I kind of opened up to my spiritual journey and looking into sexuality, the conversations that I have now with the most unsuspecting people are so refreshing, because people feel safe to come and have a conversation that they never would have had before. And they go, I can't believe I'm saying this. And I'm like, no, keep going. This is amazing. I'm so glad that you feel safe to say that. So it is it's scary, but it is a beautiful space. So for those men out there, if you are going to go through this, and as Cam said, that, you know, deer in the headlights and education and things like that, don't give up. Don't give up. Like what is on the other side is beauty, it is self-awareness, it is joy, it is love, it is pleasure, it is seduction. It's a beautiful invitation to become a deeper sense of who you are, and that will definitely change your relating, and it will 100% change who you are and who you be when you show up in business.
Yeah. Thank you for letting me rant for so long. I appreciate it.
I love it so much. I'm so passionate about this, and I'm probably going to get you back again because there were so many tips and tricks that, and you mentioned a few of them at the end. So for those of you who are interested, please jump on Cam's Instagram. It is very enlightening.
Thanks.
And explicit.
Yeah, it's explicit, yeah.
It's explicit in a great way. This is the biggest thing for me. Everything is respectful. Oh, yeah. Everything is done from such a beautiful place of respect for both parties, not just the man. As I said, for me, it was so informative and so clear, because as a woman, we want to show up and please our man just as much as they want to show up and please us. So, and as we do in business, we want to give our clients the best that we possibly can, and we want our clients to be happy with the service. So it all starts with us. And I feel like if there was one common thread of every single episode I've ever done, it starts within. It really does. So thank you for taking us down the road of healthy sexuality for the men in our world, and I look forward to watching you on your journey.
Oh,
it's an exciting one, and more cleaning up vomit from a 2-year-old. And
yeah. Well, I'm stepping into like fatherhood and sexuality and stuff a bit more. So
amazing.
Yeah, that'll be like the route I go down. It's informed by my own lived experience, really. It's all I talk about.
Yeah,
so,
of course. Well, I've got a 14-year-old at home who, if you would like to practice some of your speeches on him, I'm more than happy to lend him out for the day.
Well, I get a lot of those messages like, hey, how do I talk to my teenage about, you know, consent and boundaries and things like that. So it's something I want to look more into.
Definitely. And look, it's needed. The schools are doing a really great job with talking about those things. And I mean, we're in the Sunshine Coast, so we're quite blessed, with the support in the men's community that's around. But absolutely, all for it. For our listeners, where can they find you, and where can they learn more and potentially reach out if they need some help? Yeah,
well, you mentioned my Instagram, so that's at the Cam Fraser, and I'm also at the Cam Fraser on all social media networks, so they can find me there. And my website is cam-fraser.com. You can reach out to me via any of those avenues. I'm always open to receiving questions. I'll do my best to answer them. Sometimes people like me to post the answers publicly. Sometimes they like to keep them private. I don't mind. I try to be as receptive and open as possible, because I realize that people don't really have a lot of people to talk to about sex. Yeah. And so if I can offer an ear and offer some advice, I don't offer coaching necessarily via Instagram Messenger, but if people have a simple enough question that I can answer or point them in the right direction, then I'm happy to do that as well. Try and be a resource for folks.
Oh, it's incredible. I'm so in awe of what you're doing. So thank you for bringing it to awareness. And do you have any more in-person live events coming up?
Not on the sunny coast, unfortunately, but I've got one one sold out actually in Sydney next month at the Australian Sexual and Reproductive Health Conference. I'm also talking in Adelaide in October at the Sexology and Practice Symposium. There's a few other ones there.
All right, maybe we can find that on your social media, which is awesome, because we've got listeners all around the country and all around the world. So anyone, if you are in those states and suburbs, get along to see Cam. So thank you so much again.
No worries.
Thank you to all of my listeners for tuning in once again. This has been a really freaking cool episode. This is exactly what I want to bring to the world, is those things that maybe we don't like feeling or vulnerable and talking about and bringing to our awareness. So if there's anything that I can leave you with today, it is be curious about yourself and your needs, because who you are on the inside is who you show up as on the outside. So anything we can do internally is going to help everyone on the outside. So thank you so much again. As you know, we are the She Can Humanise Business podcast. You can find us on all social platforms, and I will see you next week. Bye. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode. I would love to hear your feedback around what resonated and what key lessons and learnings that you took out of today's episode. You can find me on Instagram and on LinkedIn under the She Can Humanise Business podcast or Kiani Mills. I really hope that you were able to see, feel and experience a new way of humanising business.